He sponsored his younger brother abroad with the little he had. He gave up his own dreams to secure a future for someone else. But when he needed help the most, that same brother turned him into a driver. What happened next? You won't believe it. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. David Williams was the first son in a humble family. His parents weren't rich, but they were respected in their small village. His father was a carpenter, his mother sold fruits at the market. Life was tough, but they managed. David was always the quiet, focused one. He believed in hard work, even when everything around him was falling apart. When their parents died just after David finished secondary school, it felt like the ground had opened beneath him. He was barely an adult, yet the weight of the family was suddenly on his shoulders. His younger brother, Richard, was still in school. There was no money, no support, just two brothers trying to survive. David didn't give up. He worked as a bus conductor for a while, later as a cleaner in a local office. He used the little money he got to pay for evening classes. It wasn't easy. Some days he went to bed hungry. Other days he would walk long distances just to save transport fare. But he kept pushing until he finally got a diploma and then a job as a junior staff in a construction company. With that job, David started saving. It wasn't much, but every little counted. He bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of the city. His plan was to slowly build a house, one block at a time, and have something to call his own. But then he looked at Richard. The boy had just finished secondary school, smart, ambitious, and full of energy. David remembered their mother's dream, that both her sons would go to university. So, instead of starting his building project, David made a decision that shocked even his closest friends. He sold the land. He used the money to process Richard's documents and pay for his studies abroad. It took everything he had. He borrowed more from friends and even took a small loan. When Richard got on the plane and waved goodbye, David stood at the airport alone, smiling through his tears. He went back home to face life again, this time with empty pockets and a heart full of hope. The years moved fast. Richard sent messages once in a while. He said he was studying hard. David was proud. He imagined the day Richard would graduate, return home and help lift the family. That was all he prayed for. Meanwhile, David's life stayed the same. He worked hard, but there was no real breakthrough. His salary barely covered rent and food. He met Sophie during that period, a simple, kind woman who understood his struggles. They got married in a small church ceremony. No crowd, no fancy clothes, just love. Soon they had 2 boys. The bills increased, the rent went up, and David's job didn't improve. Still, he believed in family. He believed in sacrifice. He believed that one day Richard would return, and life would get better. Richard came back to Nigeria after spending 5 years abroad. He looked different, taller, fresher, and more confident. He didn't come back empty-handed. He had a degree in engineering and was already talking big about opportunities and international connections. Everyone in the village was proud. Some even called him the abroad guy. David stood quietly in the background the day Richard came to visit. He didn't say much, but his heart was full of joy. The boy he once bathed, fed, and suffered for had now returned as a man. Richard didn't forget to show appreciation, at least in the beginning. He hugged David tightly and even thanked him in front of people. "If not for my brother," he said, "I wouldn't be where I am today." David smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his struggles had meaning. Not long after, Richard got a job in one of the biggest oil companies in Nigeria. The job came with a huge salary, a car, and a nice apartment in the city. His life changed completely. He started posting pictures on social media. Expensive clothes, dinner at 5-star hotels, flights from one state to another. He was living large, and people were praising him everywhere. David, on the other hand, was still managing his small job. His salary could barely take care of Sophie and the 2 boys. But he didn't complain. As long as Richard was doing well, He believed things would fall into place somehow. Maybe his younger brother would help him out. Maybe he would remember the sacrifice. Just maybe. One weekend, David took Sophie and the kids to visit Richard in the city. It was their first time entering such a big compound. The house was massive. There were 2 security men at the gate. The living room had white leather chairs and a large TV hanging on the wall like something out of a movie. Sophie looked around and smiled. She felt proud of her brother-in-law. Richard welcomed them, but he seemed a bit too busy. He was on the phone most of the time, speaking in English with a foreign accent. After a few minutes, he gave David an envelope with 10,000 naira and said, "For fuel and transport." David thanked him, but on the way home, Sophie said quietly, "This boy has forgotten where he came from." David didn't respond. He looked out the window of the bus and stayed quiet the whole way. Days passed. Weeks turned to months. Richard barely called. When he did, it was just a short, "How's the family?" and then silence again. David's rent was due. The kids were growing. Feeding became harder. His job had stopped paying regularly, and Sophie had started selling snacks to support the house. Still, David didn't want to ask for help. He didn't want to look like a beggar. But deep inside, he hoped Richard would remember. He hoped the little boy he raised like a son would now lift him up. The day David lost his job felt like the world had ended. He had been working with the construction company for over 8 years. One morning, they called for a general meeting and said the company was shutting down. Just like that. There was no warning, no severance pay, nothing. David walked home slowly that afternoon. Sophie met him at the door, smiling with a bowl of Gary in her hand. She thought he had come back for lunch. He didn't even sit down. "I've lost the job," he said. Sophie stood still for a moment, then dropped the bowl on the table. She didn't say a word. She just sat beside him and held his hand. That was the beginning of real hardship. The rent was due in 2 weeks. The kids' school fees were already overdue. The last salary David got had gone into buying food and paying debts. Sophie's small snack business wasn't bringing much. They managed on the little they had, soaking Gary, borrowing from neighbors, and praying for help. One evening, Sophie spoke up. "Talk to your brother," she said. David shook his head. "He's busy." "You helped him. You sent him abroad," she said. "He has more than enough. He can help you get back on your feet." David thought about it all night. Swallowing his pride felt like eating stones, but he knew Sophie was right. He had no job, no savings, and children who needed food and school. The next morning, he dressed up and went to Richard's house. The security man at the gate didn't even recognize him at first. "Tell him David is here," he said. When Richard finally came out, he looked surprised. Not happy, just surprised. "David, what's up?" David explained everything. He told him about the job loss, the rent, the school fees, the hunger. He didn't ask for much, just support, anything to help him get back on his feet. Richard laughed lightly, like someone who didn't want to laugh but couldn't hold it. "Look, I don't really give out money like that," he said, sipping from a glass of juice, "but I can offer you something." David looked up, hopeful. "I need a new driver," Richard said. "My last one quit. You can do that. At least you'll be earning something." David stared at him, speechless. Richard continued. "Think about it. You'll be earning monthly. You can take care of your family. It's not a bad job." David stood up slowly. "You want me to be your driver?" Richard shrugged. "What's wrong with that? You need the money, don't you?" David walked out without saying another word. That evening, he sat in silence while Sophie watched him from the corner of the room. Their children were asleep. The only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. He finally spoke. He said I should be his driver. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "What?" David nodded. She wiped her face with the edge of her wrapper. "After all you did for him." David looked down. "We don't have food, Sophie. The kids can't go to school. Maybe I should take the job." Sophie didn't respond at first. Then she said, "If that's what you have to do it. But God is watching." David started working as Richard's driver the following Monday. It was the most painful decision he had ever made, but his children needed to eat. He had rent to pay. Life had become too hard to be proud. The first day on the job, he arrived at Richard's mansion by 6 a.m., wearing a white shirt and black trousers. He had cleaned his only pair of shoes the night before. When the gate opened, he drove in slowly and parked beside the black SUV he would now be driving. Richard didn't even come out to greet him. One of the housemaids came to the car and said, "Oga say make you warm the engine." David didn't argue. He started the car and waited. It was almost 8 a.m. before Richard came out, wearing sunglasses and spraying perfume. "Hope say you sabi drive," Richard said as he entered the back seat. David nodded and drove off. The job wasn't just driving. Richard treated him like an errand boy. He would ask him to go pick up dry cleaning, deliver parcels, wait for hours at lounges, even buy food for the girls he spent time with. David swallowed it all. He had no choice. Sometimes Richard would talk about how useless some people were, knowing full well that David could hear everything. "Some people don't know how to use their brains. Imagine struggling all your life and still remaining poor," he once said while laughing with his friends in the car. David heard it. Every word. When he returned home at night, Sophie always had a warm plate of food waiting. She tried to smile, but her eyes showed how broken she felt, seeing her husband reduced to that level. The children noticed, too. One day, their younger son asked, "Mummy, is Daddy working for Uncle Richard now?" Sophie forced a smile. "Yes, my son, just for now." Another day, David came home very late. He had waited outside a club for over 5 hours while Richard partied with some women. He didn't even offer David a drink of water. That night, Sophie sat beside him while he ate his cold food. "You don't deserve this," she said quietly. David didn't look up. "I know, but this is where we are now." As the weeks passed, the humiliation increased. Richard would call him any time, even at midnight. Sometimes he would forget to pay him on time. Other times he would send him messages like, "Make sure you iron the seatbelt," or "Wash the car twice, it's dirty." And David did it all. People who used to respect him in the neighborhood now looked at him differently. Some gossiped, others avoided him. But David kept going, because deep down he believed this phase would not last forever. The longer David worked as Richard's driver, the more painful each day became. It was no longer just about the job, it was about how Richard treated him. Richard spoke to him like a houseboy. In front of his friends, he would say things like, "David, hurry up and open the gate before you sleep off there." Or, "Make sure you wash the car properly this time, not like that nonsense job you did last week." David would just nod and do it. But the insults didn't stop there. Richard's girlfriends became a problem on their own. Most of them were younger women, loud and flashy. David would drive them to spas, salons, and clubs. Some of them didn't even know he was Richard's elder brother. One day, while waiting outside a hotel, one of the girls came out and shouted, "Driver, come help me carry my bag a beg." She threw the bag at David's feet like he was her servant. He bent down, picked it up, and said nothing. Inside the car, she laughed and said to Richard, "This your driver na mumuo, he just day quiet like say them beat 'em." Richard laughed too. "Know why I like 'em, he know they talk too much." David's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, but he said nothing. Another day, Richard was in the living room, relaxed in his robe, sipping wine, and showing off a brand new Mercedes-Benz S-Class he had just bought for one of his girlfriends. He kept talking about how good the car was and how much she loved it. Just then, there was a knock at the gate. It was David's 2 sons. They had come to see their uncle. Their school had given them a final warning over unpaid fees. If they didn't pay by Friday, they would be sent home. The boys stood quietly in the sitting room, their heads down, as Richard sipped from his glass. "What do you want?" he asked. They explained everything, how their father was struggling, how their mother had no more money, how school fees were now the problem. Richard laughed and said, "So what? Because your father is my brother, I should now carry everybody's problem." The older boy tried to talk again, but Richard raised his hand. "Get out," he said, "before I call my security to throw you two out, lazy family." The boys left with tears in their eyes. David didn't know they had gone to see Richard until they returned home and told him. He sat there in silence as they spoke. Sophie sat beside him and wept. A few days later, Sophie gathered courage and went to Richard's house herself. She was tired. The house had no food. Gary had finished. The children were hungry. She wore her old gown and wrapped her scarf tightly. Her eyes were red and her voice was shaking. "Richard, please," she said. "There's no food in the house, not even rice. Help us, please. Anything you can give." Richard looked at her, smiled faintly, and said, "Don't worry. I'll send you something this evening." "God bless you," Sophie said, and left with a small smile. But evening came. Nothing. Night came. Still nothing. The next day, Sophie called him. No answer. She called again, and again. Richard ignored every single call. David noticed her quietness and asked what was wrong. She didn't answer. She just turned to the wall and cried. David sat down and stared at the ceiling. His chest was heavy. This was no longer poverty. This was punishment. Life at home had become almost unbearable. The kitchen was dry. Sophie had stopped cooking anything serious, just rice and salt water, sometimes only soaked Gary. The children didn't complain anymore. Hunger had become normal. David still went to work for Richard every day, but the weight in his chest grew heavier with each passing week. The job had become a chain around his neck, not just because of what he did, but how Richard treated him. One Saturday evening, Richard was having one of his usual parties at home. Music was loud, girls were everywhere, drinking and laughing. The compound smelled of roasted meat and expensive perfume. Cars were parked outside, some flashing their headlights as drivers adjusted their positions. David stood quietly by the gate, waiting. But tonight, he couldn't hold it in anymore. He walked up to Richard, who was seated near the poolside, surrounded by women and holding a glass of wine. "Richard," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "please, can I talk to you for just a minute?" Richard looked up, annoyed. "Can't you see I'm busy?" "Please," David said again, "it's about the children. They're being sent home from school because of fees." Richard sighed and waved off one of the girls on his lap. "Is it not the same thing every time?" he said, standing up slowly. "You think you're the only one with problems?" David stood quietly, eyes low. Richard stretched his arm, slapped David lightly on the shoulder like a joke, and said, "Don't worry, I'll send something before the week runs out. Just relax." David nodded slowly. "Thank you." He turned and walked back to his post by the gate, heart heavy, stomach empty. But deep inside, he already knew the truth. Richard had said those same words before, many times. And he never sent anything. The next few weeks were quiet but heavy. At home things didn't get better. The promised money from Richard never came. Again. Sophie had stopped asking questions. She just kept trying her best to manage whatever was available. One rainy afternoon, David came back from work early. Richard had traveled for a business trip to Dubai with one of his new girlfriends, so David had a short break. Sophie was out trying to sell some old clothes. The boys were in their room doing homework. David sat alone in the bedroom and opened the old wooden box under the bed. It was where he kept all the important papers, old certificates, letters from the past, and a few documents that no one else ever touched. He wasn't really looking for anything. He just needed to clear his head. As he flipped through the dusty files, his eyes landed on an envelope. It was brown, slightly torn at the edges, and had his name written in faded ink. He opened it slowly. Inside were documents, company share certificates. The name of the company sounded familiar, but David had almost forgotten about it. He blinked and sat up straight. Years ago, when things were better, he had invested a little money into a new oil and gas company through a friend. It wasn't much, just something small he had done before sending Richard abroad. He hadn't even followed up on it after that. He held the paper in his hand and whispered, "Is this company still around?" Curious, he asked a young neighbor who worked in IT to help him check online. The boy came back the next day with wide eyes. "Ogre David," he said, "do you know how much shares you hold in that company?" David shook his head slowly. "The company is one of the biggest now, and your shares, they're worth millions." In dollars, David stood there, frozen. He couldn't believe it. "Are you sure?" he asked. The boy nodded. "Ogre, you need to go to their office. You're sitting on a gold mine." That night, David didn't sleep. Sophie noticed something different about him. "What is it?" she asked. David showed her the documents and explained everything. Sophie gasped. "David, are you saying we're rich?" David didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her and said, "If everything checks out, yes." He didn't celebrate. He didn't scream or jump. He just sat there, quiet, the same way he had sat years ago when he sold his land to send Richard abroad. Only this time he was waiting, not for a miracle, but for confirmation that life hadn't forgotten him. David didn't waste time. The next Monday he went straight to the company's head office. He dressed in his cleanest shirt, held his documents tightly, and walked in with calm confidence. After showing his certificates and verifying his identity, the staff confirmed everything. "Yes, sir," the woman at the desk said, smiling. "You're one of our early shareholders, and the value has appreciated significantly over the years." David nodded slowly, trying not to shake. "So, what happens next?" "We'll begin the process. Once it's complete, you'll have full access to your returns. It may take a few weeks, but everything is intact." David thanked her and walked out of the building like a different man. The sun felt softer. The air felt lighter. For the first time in years, he felt like something good had finally found him. When he returned home, Sophie was outside washing clothes. He knelt down and hugged her from behind. "It's done," he whispered. That night they both prayed, not just for the money, but for wisdom to handle it well. Weeks later, the transaction was completed. David didn't waste the opportunity. He quietly began to build. He didn't start with noise or fancy things. He registered a real estate company and bought land in strategic areas. He hired professionals to help him manage the process. Everything was done legally, properly, and with a clear plan. Sophie was beside him the whole way. She helped with the office setup, the branding, and the day-to-day running. The small rented apartment they once struggled in was replaced with a proper home, not flashy, but comfortable. The boys were transferred to better schools, and every debt was cleared. David didn't stop there. He started attending business meetings, networking with investors, and partnering with companies abroad. In less than 2 years, his name began to make quiet waves in the real estate sector. From Abuja to Lagos, his company handled major property developments. Investors came calling. Newspapers started writing about a mysterious new developer making big moves. David remained silent. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't chase clout. He just worked. Meanwhile, Richard's company, the oil giant where he had once worked proudly, was losing grip. For some reason, their biggest contracts were now going to other firms. Management began to panic. Profits dropped. Projects were cancelled. Staff were uneasy. Richard didn't know why things were falling apart. What he didn't know was that the man pulling the strings from behind the curtain was David, his own brother. David had been buying up shares in the company slowly, quietly. No press, no noise, just calculated steps. The company didn't know what hit them until it was too late. It started with small changes. One week, Richard walked into the office and found out that a new board member had been added. The next month, a few senior staff were reshuffled. Then came rumors, contracts were being redirected, the company's biggest partners were pulling out. The CEO called for a meeting. He looked tired. "We're restructuring," he said. "Some shares have been sold. We have new investors. Some of you may be affected." Richard wasn't worried at first. He was one of the top staff. He had connections. He believed his job was safe. Until the day his name showed up on the list. He was among those being laid off. At first he thought it was a mistake. He walked straight to the HR office, demanding an explanation. But all they said was, "The new board is taking a different direction. It's not personal." Richard stood there, confused. "Who is the new board?" he asked. But no one gave him a straight answer. He left the office angry, slamming the door behind him. Over the next few months, everything began to fall apart. He tried to reach some of his former colleagues for job opportunities. Nothing came through. He reached out to contacts overseas. Silence. Projects he hoped to start collapsed before they even began. Slowly, the money started going. First, he sold one of his cars, then the other. He moved out of his duplex into a smaller house. His girlfriends disappeared one by one. Bills kept coming. Creditors began calling. His accounts started drying up. He tried to start a small business, but it failed. His pride was still too loud, and people had stopped listening to his noise. Then one day, the landlord of his smaller house gave him a quit notice. He had to move again, this time into a tiny one-bedroom flat in a rough part of town. No generator, no AC, just a fan that only worked when there was power. He sat on the edge of the bed one night, sweating, staring at the ceiling. How did it get this bad? He had gone from flying business class and gifting Benzes to women, to drinking sachet water and dodging calls from loan apps. One evening, he ran into a former colleague at a supermarket. The man looked shocked. "Richard, what happened? I thought you relocated." Richard laughed awkwardly, just taking a break. But inside, his stomach was turning. That night, he sat on the floor in his small kitchen, scrolling through the company's recent board announcement online. He hadn't paid attention before, but now he saw the name, David Williams, chairman/CEO. His heart stopped. He refreshed the page. It was real. His brother, the one he made his driver, now owned the company. Richard dropped the phone. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Regret. Richard stood outside the tall gate, sweating in the afternoon sun. His clothes were old and wrinkled. His shoes had cracks. His pride. Long gone. It had taken him weeks to gather the courage to come here. He had walked past the house twice already before finally stopping to knock. This was David's mansion now, a grand house with clean walls, sharp edges, flowers by the walkway, and a quiet calmness that spoke of wealth and peace. The kind of peace Richard hadn't known in years. The gate opened slowly. A security man stepped out and asked, "Who do you want to see?" Richard cleared his throat. "I'm here to see David. Tell him it's his brother." The guard looked him over, then went back inside. Soon Sophie came out. She looked at Richard with a plain face, not angry, not happy, just cold. "Good afternoon," Richard said quietly. She didn't return the greeting. "Wait here." A few minutes later, David stepped out. He stood tall, dressed in a clean shirt and dark trousers. No gold chain, no loud car horn, just presence. He looked at Richard and said nothing. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Richard began. "I've been going through a lot. I lost everything. I didn't know it was you who owned the company. I didn't know you had become—" Still, David said nothing. "I came to ask for help," Richard continued. "I know I messed up, but we're still blood. Please, I need help." David finally spoke. "You said it yourself. I was your driver, your errand boy. You mocked me. You turned your back on me and my family, and now you remember blood?" Richard lowered his head. David stepped closer to the gate. "I don't hate you. I'm not angry anymore. But whatever we had as brothers, it's over." Richard blinked fast, trying to hold back tears. "Don't ever come back here," David said. "Don't call, don't text, don't knock. I wish you well, but not in my space." He turned around and walked back inside. Sophie followed him. The gate closed quietly behind them. Richard stood there for a few seconds. Then he turned and walked away slowly, just one man on a dusty road, alone with his regret. Not long after, news began to spread around the area. Richard Williams, once a big man in one of Nigeria's top oil companies, was now working as a bus conductor, still trying to find a good job, still struggling to survive.